Hi, and welcome to the next episode here in the series looking at 6 Jewish thinkers that really shaped the Jewish world and also had a real impact on my sort of Jewish journey. And we move on from Rav Hirsch, who was our first thinker, now to Rav Dessler. And again, you may think that Rav Dessler is a strange choice to be in our series of 6, considering this is Mizrahi, because he was the Shiva of Kelm. He went to Gateshead Yeshiva, where he taught, and of course, Ponevezh. Not exactly the modern Orthodox religious Zionist journey, but very much his ideas and his works really influenced so many people in the Jewish world, including myself, which is why I very much felt he should be on this group of 6 that we're discussing. So Rav Dessler was born in 1892 in Gomel in Russia, which is now present-day Belarus. His father, Reuven Dov Dessler, was actually a disciple of one of the main leaders of the Mussar movement, which of course was really took Europe by storm in the 18th and 19th centuries, the Altar of Kelm. Rav Dessler, unfortunately, was orphaned. His mother died at a young age, and his father remarried and was a successful timber merchant in the local city of Gomel. And of course, what's interesting, both Rav Hirsch and Rav Dessler, both their fathers were businessmen. And yet, of course, the sons eventually went into the rabbinate and had huge impact on the Jewish world. Eventually, Rav Dessler's father would actually lose a lot of his living due to the Russian Revolution, which in many ways led to the family relocating to England, which is the next part of the story. But first, Rav Dessler went to study in Kelm, again, where his father had studied. And Kelm was a very unique institution because unlike many of the institutions, yeshivot in Eastern Europe, it had a secular study alongside the religious studies, which meant and encouraged many of the students when they graduated to actually pursue a career, a livelihood, rather than having to go into the rabbinate. And again, Rav Dessler, initially, that's the path that he felt. He got a rabbinic ordination from Chaim Ozer Gudrinsky while he was at Kelm, but he actually entered business with his father after he got married in 1920. He married the granddaughter of the Altar of Kelm. But his stepmother died in 1928, and he then went with his father for medical treatment for his father in London, and he stayed there and created his next stage of his career, where he changed from businessman into the rabbinate, and he actually became a Rav in the East End of London, in Dalston in northeast London. His family came over from Europe and joined him in 1931. Now, here's where I find the story fascinating for me as well, personally for me, because while he was in Dalston, again, he found himself there because of what happened with his father moving. He's in Dalston, and he begins to teach Torah. And he teaches Torah to a group of young people. He's mainly working for the Sassoon family, but also teaching local children as well. One of those children that he teaches is a pupil called Aryeh Carmel, who eventually goes on to translate all of his works later on in his career and allowed Rav Dessler's works to come to an entire new generation of Jews in the English-speaking world, one of them being me. Then he was asked to go up to Gateshead. This was around the early 1940s. There was a new institution, and again, very unusual to have a kollel in Western Europe. It was one of the first, and he was very much a fundraiser, a mashgiach, and obviously very involved in the running of the yeshiva. And then in the late 1940s, he was asked to move from Gateshead to Bnei Brak to become the mashgiach ruchani for the Ponevezh yeshiva, which he did. Now, at that time, of course, it coincided in the late 40s with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. And what's interesting, Rav Dessler wasn't a Zionist in the classic sense, but he was positive about the creation of the state in 1948. He writes in one of his works, "It is hard to label our presence in the Holy Land now as the beginning of our redemption. It is, however, a great kindness on God's part." And again, when you understand Rav Dessler, and you have to view it, what he was saying in the spiritual and social context of the early years of Medinat Yisrael. Ponevezh was where he taught, was headed by an amazing Rav Yosef Shlomo Kahneman. And Rav Kahneman welcomed the establishment of the State of Israel. In fact, he perceived it as a divine awakening and anticipation of the redemption. And he ordered, it's very well known, that the Israeli flag be flown at Ponevezh Yeshiva, and he hosted many leaders of the state in those early years. And again, it may therefore be assumed that Rav Dessler's positive views of the state, obviously not in a messianic way, in the Reshit Smicha Golatenu, but certainly in a thankful way to God for the state of Israel, could be because in the early years of the state, the Haredi world was very positive about the creation of the state of Israel, and of course his closeness he had to Rav Kahneman as well. Rav Dessler died suddenly in 1953. He was just 61 years old, a huge loss to the Jewish world, because what he taught, his whole ideology, his whole way of life was incredibly inspiring to anybody who came across him. And it's so interesting that so many of his students really went on to great things in the Jewish world. His ideas were formulated into the Sefer Michtav Eliyahu, which was translated, I said, into English by Rav Carmel. And it's those thoughts in those volumes we're going to be exploring over the next few weeks to understand the beautiful ideology and the impact that Rav Dessler had on the Jewish world and on me, especially as a student at Leeds University. See you next week.